The following is an encore presentation of a pre-recorded program. To join one of our many live presentations, please visit cje.net/events, call 773-508-1000, or follow us on your favorite social media platform.
But it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Being mindful of our time, I may be a little bit speedy today, and there may be a few slides that I have to skip over, but we'll get through as much of the content as we can. All right. I have a few learning objectives for today. The first is for us to really kind of drive home the importance of communication, not just as a way of getting messages across, but as a form of connecting for people who have dementia and their family members. I want us to really kind of focus today on the effects of these conversation challenges and communication challenges and how they affect social communication, but also the care partners and their quality of life and health. And then we'll spend some time at the end of today's talk with some real kind of strategies, this kind of notion of not necessarily prescriptive, but some ideas to spark inspiration and also practical aspects of communicating with people who have dementia. So we think about conversation difficulties are being those challenges that sometimes people with dementia have that result from both memory changes, but also speech and language changes in the context of dementia, and how that affects their ability to convey their needs and wants with their family members, but also their friends and neighbors. So at one level, we think about these as being challenges to just stimulation, things that might affect how much cognitive stimulation a person receives, or whether or not it gives them this kind of opportunity to kind of be cognitively engaged. But there's another reason for us to be really thoughtful around these communication challenges. That's because they have this secondary effect on both the person with dementia as well as their care partner with these kind of constructs that we think about as being social isolation and loneliness. We've heard a lot about this over the kind of last year and a half because of COVID, but this construct of social isolation and loneliness in dementia and in dementia caregiving has been around for many, many years prior to us thinking about COVID or really being physically isolated from one another. So I want to touch base on a couple of constructs here that are relative to kind of being a motivation for why thinking about and working on better conversations with people who have dementia is important. And the first is this construct of social isolation, and the second is loneliness. These really are two very separate constructs when we think about them in science, and we can measure them differently. Social isolation is really just the number of contacts that you have. So certainly COVID has wreaked havoc, and living in a time of the pandemic has wreaked havoc on our number of social contacts. But loneliness can occur even when we are not socially isolated. And we define loneliness as being this gap between desired and actual social contact. What we know is that while adding just more people in your social circle may take care of social isolation, it does not necessarily change your perception of feeling lonely. And so people with dementia and their care partners, even if they have lots of social engagement or they are attending group programs, can also still have this sensation of loneliness. What does kind of take care of these aspects of loneliness is the meaningfulness and the quality of the social interactions that they have. And that's where kind of thinking about how we can better support conversations, how we can better support caregivers and family members with dementia and having better conversations gives us the opportunity to really block these kind of negative effects of social isolation. And we want to do this because loneliness in and of itself, just being lonely, is a risk for dementia. Social isolation is problematic and it can lead to loneliness. And lots of times people who are lonely will also report being socially isolated. But at the end of the day, it really is this phenomenon of loneliness that gives us this greater risk for dementia. So not only is loneliness associated with developing dementia, and cognitive decline, but it is also a factor that worsens the progression of dementia. So I'll spend a little bit of time here kind of focusing on the care partners, because what we know is that, and these concepts are linked because care partners are at higher risk of also developing loneliness in addition to the person who has dementia. And we know that about 35 million people in this country are providing care to someone who is aged 50 and older. And about 16 million of those people are caring for someone who has some form of dementia. This isn't always a phenomenon, though, of older adults, and this is something for us to be aware of. With growing frequency, we're actually seeing that younger and younger people are being involved in dementia caregiving. In fact, about 1 in 4 of all caregivers, so it's roughly 25% of caregivers, are actually millennials, meaning they're people in their 30s and 40s. And about 15% of those people care for someone who has dementia. In fact, when we look at the numbers specifically from this group, what we see is that quite a few of them are actually caring for not just one person who has dementia, but perhaps multiple people who have dementia in their home. And so this is the case where you might have someone in their mid-40s who's caring, for example, for a parent who has dementia. They may also be caring for a grandparent who has dementia. So these people, as well as what we think about as being more typical caregivers, people over the age of 50, are most definitely at increased risk for social isolation and loneliness. In fact, just a little over 40% of all care partners report some degree of moderate loneliness, and about 18% of caregivers of persons with dementia report severe loneliness. And we think these are risks that are up and above what would be there if they were not caring for someone who has dementia. So these are not just age-related risks. These are elevated risks of dementia or elevated risk of loneliness because they are caring specifically for someone who has dementia. One of the reasons that we think this actually happens is not just because in the context of caring for a person with dementia, you can become more isolated or more socially isolated from others. But it also has to do with the loss of familiarity, the loss of intimacy, the loss of connection to your family member who has dementia, whether that's your spouse or whether that's a parent. And I want to touch on a point here that is a growing area of research by our group and others, which is that in particular, the LGBTQ community seem to be at higher risk of social isolation and caregiving stress, and their loneliness factors seem to be a bit higher. When we think about solutions, I'm always a solution-focused person. I can see the problems, but seeing the problems is only worthwhile if we can find the solutions. And for us, the solutions are to think about programs and kind of group-based programs that help to reduce the stress of caregiving, but also to really think about restoring some of these conversation patterns or conversation difficulties or challenges communicating between persons with dementia and their family members as a way of restoring that sense of intimacy and connection within the family unit. So a lot of the research that we do is focused on this kind of study of how do conversations break down in the context of dementia. And we study this because it is the single most important mechanism for creating and maintaining meaningful social connections. So we know that conversations, or what is a conversation, we have them all the time, and we're almost, we learned how to talk without really thinking about it. We learned how to have conversations with others without really thinking about it. It was just something that kind of implicitly became a part of our lives. But in the context of dementia, the challenges that we see both in memory, finding words, learning to speak, moving and mobilizing around, being able to use your hands to communicate, your facial expressions to communicate, all of those things begin to gradually break down the structure of conversation that we learned so easily and so implicitly as we matured into, adult humans. But conversation is not only this interaction between two or more people. We know it to be uniquely human. We know that its purpose is to convey information between two people, so to get a message across, something that we call transactional communication. It's also really critical when thinking about how do we establish and maintain relationships with other people, this notion of interactional communication. It's this interactional piece that becomes particularly lost in the context of dementia. And when it fails, we have absolute evidence that this relationship between conversation difficulties, or how quickly and how efficiently and how accurately can two humans get information to exchange between each other. We know that when conversations break down in the context of dementia, that it's associated with lower quality of life for both the person with dementia and their family member, higher caregiver burden, meaning there's this direct relationship, and we've actually just shown this in a study of people with primary progressive aphasia, a form of dementia that affects people when they're younger. This direct relationship between the severity of conversation difficulties and perceived caregiving burden. We know that it can create challenges just getting everyday activities completed, like dressing and bathing and getting out to the doctor. And as I've already spent some time talking about, it increases risk for social isolation and loneliness. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide just because we are a bit short on time today because of our late start. But the real drive home message for this slide is that there are many, many forms of dementia that range from Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's dementia, Parkinson's disease, vascular cognitive impairment, a form of dementia that's caused by having small strokes over time, the frontotemporal dementias, dementia such as primary progressive aphasia that I just spoke about, that can affect language and the ability to find words and put them together into sentences, as well as forms of dementia associated with Parkinson's disease or movement issues. Regardless of the form of dementia, though, there can be changes in speech and thinking skills and the ability to find words that can affect conversation. So we don't think about this as just being an Alzheimer's disease or an Alzheimer's dementia problem. It really is an issue across the spectrum of dementias. So I'll take here just a minute to kind of break down what are some of these changes that we see in conversation. And certainly if you are living with someone who has dementia, or if you work with people who have dementia, you may have seen several of these behaviors. And in our work, one of the methodologies that we use is we actually kind of do this fly on the wall technique where we do detailed recordings of people in their homes. And we study hours and hours and hours of conversations, not just to look at what's going wrong, but also to look at what is going right. And it's that kind of body of research that I'll be sharing with you today. Some of the real key problems that we see in communication exchanges between people with dementia and their family communication partners include things like long pauses. So these long pauses when you're taking turns back and forth that kind of leave the care partner not knowing whether or not the person with dementia is paying attention or not paying attention in the conversation, whether they've been understood or they've not been understood. And what happens when we have long pauses in conversations are fascinating to study as a human behavior, because we are so hardwired to know exactly how long a pause should be before we kind of think, oh gosh, this person's not engaged, I should jump in and fill this quiet space or this airspace. And that's something that you don't even have to think about. Your brain just automatically processes it. That's one of the things that when it's broken in the context of dementia that we see really being problematic, because care partners and others jump back into the conversation to fill that dead space. And that actually disrupts the thought processes of the person with dementia, because all they really needed was more time, but our brains haven't adjusted. Those of us without dementia, it hasn't adjusted to that extra long time that we have to perceive in the conversation turn. We think about there being unclear verbal signals. So someone who is saying they're happy, but their face isn't conveying that. These are another source of conversation struggles when you're having a conversation with someone who has dementia. slowed processing of information, the fact that it just takes more time to both process what someone is saying, but also to put your ideas together to say it. This leads again to that issue of kind of long pause, or this dyssynchrony between the two speakers in terms of turn taking. The use of what we think about as ambiguous or incorrect words. So someone says orange when they actually meant banana. Someone says, I want to go to the store when they actually meant the park. And the fact that as care partners, we sometimes have to learn to listen around, to work around what those errors are and try to predict what that person actually meant to say. And this can be a real challenge in conversations. The limited number of topics or repetitive question asking can also be problematic, meaning that people with cognitive problems oftentimes need to ask the same questions over and over again. We think about that as being a self-comforting behavior. Sometimes it's linked to memory issues, but often it's a self-comforting behavior where people ask these kind of repeated questions of where's my daughter, where's my daughter, where are we going, where are we going? And it's a self-stimulation behavior that can be quite disruptive in conversations, as well as kind of too much talking or too little talking. So as we get older, hearing loss is also really problematic, and it kind of compounds the issues that we see in dementia. So we know that roughly a third to 40% of all people over the age of 65 have some form of hearing loss. Certainly not all of those people are identified, and most of them do not have hearing aids or any type of assisted listening device. And what we see in our work, with lots of times the research that we're doing is quantifying how many times does a conversation break down. If we're, again, the fly on the wall in your house and watching these conversations, we look for the number of times that a conversation breaks down, meaning the message doesn't get across, or there's a misunderstanding. And we can see in the context of hearing loss, if someone has dementia plus hearing loss, we see about a 10 to 20% increase in the number of those conversation breakdowns compared to people who have dementia but who do not have hearing loss. And so this kind of aspect of thinking about hearing on top of cognitive changes is really important in these populations. So again, I'll slide past these slides pretty quickly, again, being mindful of kind of our shortened session today. And here I'm focusing primarily on dementia of the Alzheimer's type or Alzheimer's dementia. But the real take-home message across these next few slides is that while we think about conversation or communication issues in dementias, we also think about what are the preserved abilities that people have. So we're always looking at, again, at what is the nature of the problem, but also what remains intact. And we're thinking about how those problems change in severity over time. So to give you a bit of an idea here, in the early stages of dementia, and here again, we're focusing on Alzheimer's, we know that people are aware of their communication difficulties. They are aware that their conversations are not going well. They often will know that they're not getting the name of a word correctly or the name of a person correctly, and they try to correct, or they actually adopt strategies for how to get around their word finding issues. And this is something we see kind of in the early stages of dementia. People are incredibly strategic. When they come to sit with us, when we're starting to work with them on an intervention of helping to communicate better, they can distinctively tell you, they and their caregivers, we do this and it works for us, or it doesn't work for us. In early stages, most people can communicate sufficiently for many of the social situations that they are in. But if there are more speakers, there's more people at the dinner table, the environment is noisier, then they certainly will have more challenges. But once we get to the late stage, and this is that kind of arc of progression that we see not only in Alzheimer's dementia, but in a variety of these dementias, is that the vocabulary becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And you see this, even though we're talking about dementia of the Alzheimer's type, this is really kind of a uniform feature of most dementias, that over time, it's not that they are, in some cases, in some dementias, people are actually losing their words. We see that in a variant of semantic dementia, which is part of the primary progressive aphasia syndrome. So they're actually kind of losing the concept that goes with a word. But in most dementias, what people are losing is the ability to retrieve or access the words that they want to use. That becomes really important here in a few minutes when I talk about some of the strategies that might be helpful for people. You can start to see more challenges as dementias progress with these stuttering-like behaviors, or what we think about as being mispronunciations of words. We see that classically in dementias that are associated with movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease, but we can also see that in Alzheimer's dementia and in the vascular dementias as well. One of the characteristics that we also see in later stages of dementia, regardless of the cause, is that the person with dementia becomes much more dependent on facial expressions and word and stress patterns, the emotional tone of voice, body language, and gestures to be able to understand in conversations. And so as a communication partner of someone with dementia, it is incredibly important that your emotions be aligned with your facial expressions, be aligned with your body language. If, for example, you are saying, I love you and I want to go to the park with you today, but your body language is tense and you might be a little bit frustrated, the person with dementia will probably read the stress and the frustration and respond and react to that more than the positiveness of words. And so this notion of having to become less dependent on words themselves and more dependent on what we think about as the nonverbal aspects of language is important to remember. However, we also know that there are overall preserved abilities. And here I give you an idea about what those are in dementia of the Alzheimer's type. But we also see preserved abilities in people with primary progressive aphasia, frontotemporal dementias broadly, Parkinson's disease-related dementias. And so each one of these dementias has kind of these preserved pockets of abilities. We'll talk a little bit here about those in dementia of the Alzheimer's type. But people with Alzheimer's dementia still have intact ability to pull on memories of procedurally learned information. So this is how we explain why a person with Alzheimer's disease can still play the piano, for example, when they're not able to produce very many words, or their ability to sing the lyrics of a familiar song that's been practiced over and over again. So when we think about these procedural memories, these are memories that have become so encoded and so stored because the person has done the same thing over and over and over again over their lifetime. So while knowledge of events may be lost in Alzheimer's disease, memories of people and places that someone has been may be lost in the context of Alzheimer's disease. These procedural memories become rather well preserved. And that's important because we can tap into that knowledge. We can tap into those preserved abilities to be able to connect and engage in meaningful activities with the person who has dementia. They are often able to still engage in social rituals. And one of the most important things that we have to remember in the context of dementia care, from my perspective, is that the desire for interpersonal communication is never lost. And this is true across all of the forms of dementia. Someone may not be able to engage in the same way. Someone may not be able to do all the things that they were able to do before, but their desire to be social and to be personally connected with another human being is not affected by dementia. They may appear to be more withdrawn, but that withdrawal comes from the challenges of connecting and the challenges in communicating with another person. It's frustrating, and the response is often to withdraw or to pull back. But that should never be misinterpreted as a desire to not connect with another human being, or to that person no longer prioritizes interpersonal communication and just wants to be alone. The person with dementia may need more time alone to kind of have time to decompress from all of the cognitive effort that it takes to engage with others. but that's not the same thing as a loss of a desire to communicate. And this is one of those, we have to talk to families and to care providers about this all the time. Because this kind of notion of pulling back or withdrawing can also be interpreted as a lack of desire for interpersonal communication when it's not that at all. So I'll slide past this really quickly because this was just a summary slide that says, really connecting through communication is critical. And it's critical because it lessens the burden of caregiving, it promotes cognitive health, it reduces isolation and loneliness, and it supports psychological well-being and quality of life. So I'll transition here for the next few minutes, and I appreciate you all being patient while I kind of move through some of this information quickly today. I know it's a lot, but I'm going to spend a bit of time here talking about how we, and meaning my research lab, there's a couple of programs that we've designed for people and families living with dementia. The first is this one called Restructuring Conversations, which is for families of people living with Alzheimer's dementia. The second is a program called the Communication Bridge Intervention, which I do with my colleague, Dr. Emily Rogalski at the Mesolam Center. And that's a program, a telehealth rehabilitation program for speech and language interventions that we have for people with primary progressive aphasia. And there's a lot of crossover between these two programs. But I'm going to share with you today some of the lessons that we've learned from, in specific, the program that we've done in Alzheimer's dementia. So the principles that we base our interventions on here are really important. It's not just the strategies that we teach, but how we teach them and how we help family members to kind of adjust their perspective of communication challenges in the context of dementia. And so there are a couple of fundamental principles that we focus on here. The first is that we have this kind of very open discussions around helping people to understand that all humans are interconnected and there's an interdependence amongst human beings, and that communication is this kind of primary linkage in keeping humans connected, and conversation certainly sits at the center of that, a lot of what we've already been talking about this morning. We also help people with dementia and their family members because we treat them together in the same intervention. We don't kind of give teaching to the family member and then teaching or therapy to the person with dementia. We work with them together, what we call a dyad-based intervention. One of the first things that we also try to get across is that people with dementia and their care partners are survivors, not victims. We want to empower versus allowing dementia to take over their lives. And we also help care partners to understand that they are facilitators, what we think about as being the ramp for the person with dementia. So their job is to facilitate, set up the environment to help reveal the successes of their loved one with dementia. And so all of these are kind of at the foundation of the programs that we've developed. Won't spend as much time on this slide, but I want to focus on two pieces that come out of this that, again, are key to the intervention programs that we run and key to the research that we do. And it's this notion that collaboration is king here, so that it is important that we align the person with dementia and their caregiver together in tasks, and then we teach them to work together to achieve goals. And those goals often are centered around communication events. And we try to make sure that in all of the steps of our intervention that we are helping care partners learn how to negotiate preferences with the person who has dementia, and that we're validating, we're acknowledging their expertise, we're acknowledging the person with dementia's feelings, or what we call their personhood, their unique sense of identity. So when we teach communication strategies, we're not just kind of giving people a list of strategies and say, hey, go home and do these 32 things. They're going to make your life perfect again. A, that's not true and it doesn't work. And B, it is really important that we anchor these strategies to the individual needs of each dyad. And we mean the person with dementia and their family member. So the strategies that might work for the person with dementia and their spouse partner may be very different than the strategies that work for the person with dementia and their child, or the person with dementia and their sibling. And so part of how we approach this problem is not to give a uniform list of strategies that you can print off of any dementia awareness site, but to fine-tune those strategies and to build capacity for adapting those strategies within each of the individual dyads. And that's why these principles of thinking about kind of positive care interactions and validation and collaboration are so key to the processes that we do, because it's not kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'll go over some of the basic teachings that we use in our programs. And one of the first principles, outside of kind of just getting people set up to think differently around what communication is and the purposes of conversation and the purposes that it serves, is to teach them how to first set up the environment. And so we spend a lot of time actually in people's homes and also in the clinic saying, gosh, you have to set up for success first. If you walk in the room and you're starting to have a conversation with someone who has dementia and the TV is going, the radio's on, the lighting is poor in the room, it's not going to be very successful. And so we teach people first out of the gate to reduce distractions, to be really aware of what's going on in your environment. If the person with dementia walks into the kitchen to tell you something and the sink is running and you're doing dishes, turn off the sink, turn around and face them. Make sure that people have their hearing aids and glasses on at all times. This notion of choosing the time of day carefully to optimize communication is a really important one to pay attention to. Sometimes the feedback that we can actually get from people, the person who actually has dementia themselves is, my care partner wants me to go all the time. They want me to go to day program in the morning and then have a conversation partner over in the afternoon to do an activity. And then in the evening, they want to do puzzles together. I just need a break. And that's true. People with dementia need more downtime to be able to cope, as I was talking about earlier, with the cognitive stresses of what happens in their day. Participating in conversation may take them 5, 10, 15, or even 20 times more effort than it does you. For us, it's effortless. For them, it's a lot of work. And so being able to have time alone to go for a walk or to do a quiet activity or to just be with themselves sitting in the yard is an important component to making sure that they are optimized for the important conversations or talking moments when they occur. And so you do want to think about choosing times of day carefully. If you're going to have a long conversation or engage someone in a game or something that's a cognitive stimulation activity, you want to watch for the pattern of what is their best time of day. Maybe it's after an afternoon nap, or maybe it's first thing in the morning, but not later on in the evening. A colleague of mine, a friend of mine whose husband has early changes in cognition that's associated with his Parkinson's disease, and he's a fairly young man in his mid-50s. They still have young children at home. I think, gives one of these most fantastic words of wisdom, which is they don't have any meaningful conversations in their house. They don't deal with any big issues after 6 o'clock at night. That's just a rule in their house. If it comes up after 6 o'clock at night, it gets dealt with the next day, and that's a particularly bad time of day for him, and he's not effective at communication then. So thinking about times of day, ensuring that there's an ample amount of uptime and downtime and rest time for the person with dementia is really important. And you want to have your supplies. You want to have Sharpies and index cards and blank paper, because sometimes, and we're going to talk about a strategy called keywording, the best thing you can do is write down the word while you're saying it to help the person with dementia to be able to follow along in a conversation. And this final point of keeping visits or activities short. Now, the amount of time that you can kind of do these focused activities depends on a person's severity of dementia and how tired they are in any context. But I like to envision activities as being about half an hour long. Some people may be able to go longer and others shorter, but really knowing not just what is the right time, but what is the right length or the right duration of a conversation exchange so everyone can be successful. Other things to keep in mind are to be present, truly present. That doesn't mean you're distracted by the 17 emails going off on your phone or the other things that need doing around the house. Remember I said, as dementia progresses, people with dementia become tuned into the nonverbals of a conversation, not just the words. And so it is important, if you are not present and accounted for in your own emotions and in your own intentions at the time of the conversation, then what will happen is the person with dementia will begin to check out. And we also want to make sure that you're adjusting your expectations around the quality, quantity, and accuracy of how much conversation is enough. All right, so I'm going to skip over this one just a bit to kind of think about spending a bit more time here on what are the types of activities that are engaging. And we think about these, and I put a whole list of activities on the left-hand side that we know are good stimulation activities for people with dementia. And they include things like music and art, putting together photo albums or life story books. But I want to talk about a couple of key things and how to make these activities go successfully. And the first of these is kind of toward the end of the list, which is you want to drop any performance expectations and you want to avoid testing behaviors. When you're connecting meaningfully with a person, it is super important that does not become a test, right? It is not about trying to cue them on how much they remember or whose name they remember or whether or not they recall an activity they did from 10 years ago. It is about the moment of connecting. That moment is as good as it is in that moment. And you're not holding over grudges from a communication moment in the morning or having expectations that communication be as good as it was the day before or at an earlier event. It's incredibly important to hold just in that moment what it is that you want to get out of that moment in terms of connecting with your loved one. Here, we often train family members to think about modeling and showing a behavior. If you want someone to kind of put a picture into a picture album, then you want to model that behavior. You want to show them how to do it several times, maybe not even talking, just doing. And if you'll just do and not talk so much, which means that then there's more for the person to process visually than to have to listen to the words, you will often see that the person with dementia will start to pick up and do the same activity. So we call that modeling, showing, or co-constructing in an activity. One of the remarkable things that we see with people with dementia is their desire to be engaged, even if they're just watching the activity. And so it's also a-okay if the person with dementia doesn't do much in the activity at all, but they're just watching. That's another form of engagement that is incredibly important. I'm going to skip over the previous slide to say just a few more additional tips here before wrapping up to take a few questions. From a topic management standpoint, one of the things, and we talked about this kind of difficulty of going back and forth and the long pauses. Here, it's important to try to take steps to allow time for processing and not to jump in and talk over your partner. I talked about how challenging that was at the beginning of this talk, and I'm coming back to it now because this notion of over talking or jumping in too quickly is one of the primary disruptions that we see in dementia conversations. And over time, it has the impact of causing the person with dementia to pull back and pull back and pull back. And we've seen this an awful lot in our research. It's not just the dementia itself that's problematic, but the behaviors of their care partner that actually affects whether or not they're more socially engaged or more withdrawn. And so the more of this overtalk behavior that occurs, the more over time you see the person with dementia pulling back from conversations. There's a direct linkage between the two, even when their dementia isn't changing. And so you want to kind of minimize this overtalk or talking over behavior. This notion of keywording is a strategy we find really helpful. What it means is that you're holding up a piece of paper and you're actually writing out keywords that are in your conversation as you're talking. And that allows the person with dementia to follow the path of the conversation. So for example, if I were talking about what we were planning for Thanksgiving dinner, I might say, we're going to have cheese on Thursday night. I'm going to think about cheddar, Swiss, or Stilton. Which one do you want? right? So then the person with dementia can actually point to or circle the cheese type that they would like. They are not required to hold all of that information in memory because you've just written down keywords that let them follow the conversation and come back to the conversation without it being so memory demanding. So this keywording approach is one that we find really effective. It is okay to fill in missing information. That's perfectly allowed as long as you're negotiating the rules around that with your partner, right? So they may want you to fill in information some of the time, like at a family dinner conversation where there's lots of people around the table. But maybe other times where it's just one-on-one, they want to try to come up with the idea of the words themselves. And so we often think about filling information is great, as long as there's this negotiated set of rules between you and the person with dementia. Always provide additional time. I've hammered that home in a lot of different ways today, both in this kind of notion of it's just going to take longer, and also in this notion of not jumping in and not being so quick to jump in to overtalk the person with dementia. But the more time you allow, the smaller amounts of information that you present, the more time you allow for people to process something I've not had the leisure to give you today, the better overall the conversation will be. We spend a lot of time teaching families how to use these multimodal supports. So not only the keyword approach that I talked to you about, but also this notion of using pictures and printed words and objects from the environment to help people with dementia to communicate. And when you're developing these kind of picture cards that you can use around the house, we prefer people to use real world pictures or photographs, and those can also be taken in your environment. So if someone really loves your macaroni and cheese, and that's a common thing that might appear on your family menu, then actually take a picture of the macaroni and cheese you've made in a bowl that's in your house. So the more context there is, and that's the point here, the more context that there is, and the more that context comes from the person's real world environment, the better. These can be put in a book. They can be positioned around the house. They can be on your phone. We train people to walk around and take pictures of their environment. So when they can't say the words, they can show the words of what they did that day in forms of pictures stored on their phone. So but the notion is to kind of think about communicating not just with words, but also with the supportive pictures. And I'll skip over a few of these. What I do want to wrap up by saying is inevitably conversations are going to break down. So no matter how many strategies we put into place, conversations are going to fail and breakdowns are going to occur. An expectation of anything else is unrealistic. But when they do occur, we have to repair those. And lots of times what we see in our work is family members just learn to walk away from the person with dementia, and that leaves the person with dementia feeling a sense of loss of personhood, a loss of identity, and a perception of failure. And so we try to teach family members how to spend time in these conversations doing repairs. A couple of ways that you want to do that is to actually ask for help. I don't think I understood you correctly. Can you say that again? So if you're not sure that you've understood the person correctly, actually ask them. And you can repeat what they said. Did I understand you to say you wanted cheddar cheese for Thanksgiving dinner, right? Just check in to make sure that you've understood that what they've said so that you can push the conversation forward. We talk about repeating and simplifying information if needed, rephrasing and adding new information, clarifying with pictures, objects, or gestures in all the way that we've talked about, and staying calm. And then the last thing I'm going to point out here before wrapping up is the single most important behavior we try to get rid of is getting rid of things like saying what, huh, and a. So remember, I'm Canadian, so I have to throw my a in there. But if someone says something to you that you don't understand and you say, huh, that does not tell that person at all what was not understood. And so that's where we go back to this need for very specific kind of phrases. I did not understand the last word. What was the last word you said? I did not understand that sentence. Can you try it again? Right? But these non-specific prompts, which become very, very much a part of dementia conversations, can be challenging. So I'll leave it there to say social isolation and loneliness we know can be addressed conversation is critical to meaningful social interactions. Flexible use of communication strategies is totally key. Not every strategy is going to work all the time, so it is incredibly important to be flexible and to learn how to repair conversation breakdowns when they occur. Being mindful of time, I will stop there. I am sorry I had to rush through some of this content today, but hope you found it helpful, and I'm really happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. This was an amazing, amazing presentation and lots of wonderful lessons that I would also say probably could work for communication with anyone, many of these strategies. So a couple of questions from the audience. Thinking back to the topics of loneliness and social isolation, are those with dementia aware of their loneliness? And if they are, sort of, when does that sort of happen in the progression of the disease? And what might we see that would indicate that people are expressing loneliness if they can't articulate it?
What a fantastic question. And I think this is an area that we are starting with different research tools now are starting to understand more and more. One of the interests that we have is in measuring this physiologically, so that we can find out, I think, just at the heart of this question, when is it that people become aware, and how do we know that they're aware, and what are the interventions that we put into place, and how do we know that they're responding to them, right? So we've been playing around with how do we use some wearable sensors of things like heart rate and blood pressure to help us tell when someone is stressed or when they're feeling more lonely. And those methods, not just by our group, but by others, are certainly starting to take hold. But the kind of short answer is we're learning more and more about this. But I will say we do have early studies that show that people with dementia, even in the earliest stages of dementia, and we have done some of this in our own work, are acutely aware of that sense of social isolation and loneliness. And we think while it would vary across people, it does kick in pretty early in the course of dementia. Some of the subtle behaviors that you can see are withdrawing. Even resistance behaviors have been linked to a sense of social isolation and loneliness. So in more advanced dementia stages, what we sometimes call needs-driven behaviors or reaction behaviors in dementia can actually be driven by this phenomenon of feeling socially isolated and withdrawn from others. And we know that because when we put more meaningful social engagements in place, those behaviors abate or go away. So we have this kind of direct linkage of, we see these behaviors that are aggression behaviors, we put meaningful social interactions and engagement strategies in place, and then those behaviors stop. So, we actually think this is present throughout the dementia spectrum. We think even in advanced stages of dementia, people maintain awareness of feeling socially isolated or not engaged with others. We're getting better at tools for being able to detect it. And the behavioral manifestations can be myriad, everything from just withdrawing to actually being aggressive or reacting in behaviors.
Thank you. Another question has come up about talking on the telephone. And so what might specific strategies be when you cannot see the person in front of you? And how should telephone conversations be approached?
Gosh, that's a really good one. And I also saw a few slides where a few questions with people asking for the slides. I'm more than happy to send those out, Margaret, and you can distribute them. And I'll add a slide in there around what do you do when you're on the phone, because I've got one of those as well. So the phone is really hard because they can't see you and you can't see them. So this is actually where the pandemic has given us some hope in terms of Zoom and teaching people how to use video conference software. And we've now said to people that should be your mainstay communication, or setting up a weekly phone call time with a loved one through Zoom. And we have had surprising success with even people with, moderate stage dementia being able to learn how to use Zoom. So that's actually been a positive of the pandemic. But when phone is the primary mechanism, the first thing we'd always say is make sure your phone connection is good, so you're not on a spotty cell phone signal. Those are when you really want to slow down, add more time between words and sentences, and use all of those really good checking in strategies. So did you understand what I said? Especially if someone's quiet on the other end. Do you need me to repeat that? Would you like for me to say that again? So those validation and checking in strategies toward the end of the slide, that slowing down and almost allowing more time than you would in a face-to-face conversation. All of those strategies have to be amped up when you're talking with someone over the phone, just for those reasons.
That's very, very, very helpful. Do we have time for one more question?
Sure, that's up to you all.
Well, the information you're providing, I could probably ask you questions and talk about this for hours. So, you might want to give a time limit to us here. So a question sort of has come up on, when we're thinking about the research, are there any real effective treatments or cures or medications or anything? What's on the horizon that we might be looking for a treatment?
Yeah, fantastic question again. So I think, all of us are looking for the magic pill, so to speak, that makes all of the problems that we work on with people go away. So I am the first one to say if they found a cure for dementias and all forms of it tomorrow, I'd be overjoyed, even if that put me out of work. So, but the kind of real answer is no, we don't have any great treatments yet. In primary progressive aphasia, for example, which is a lesser known form of dementia, is, one of the things that we actually see in that is that there are no drug-based treatments, but our behavioral treatments in terms of teaching families how to work on these types of strategies actually do work. And we have a phase 2 clinical trial now. It's a randomized clinical trial where we're actually showing that and getting ready to apply to for our phase 3 funding. So we do know that these behavioral interventions are working. On the Alzheimer's side, we have evidence across a number of kind of behavioral programs that teach communication strategies that those also work on a number of outcomes, quality of life, but also reducing some of the needs-driven behaviors, aggressive behaviors, and things like repetitive question asking, that over and over again question asking that some people with dementia can do. We know we can reduce those down in some people by as much as 2/3. So while the pharmacological interventions may not be giving us much hope here, we do know that the behavioral interventions do work and do hold promise. They don't necessarily work for forever, right? And I don't mean to misconvey that they do. But what they can do is in those stair steps of decline that we see in dementia, they can lengthen out the time before we see that next kind of precipitous fall or severity drop, and that's where they help, and they can also improve quality of life within those stages. I did see one comment on there in terms of phones show text, and that's correct. Some phones do show text, not just text in terms of a smartphone. So if you have an Android or an iPhone smartphone, but you can actually get text generating a technology that's used in people who have hearing loss that will work on a more traditional or conventional phone. So that does work well for some people. One challenge is that the transcription services are always not great on those. So word errors do happen, which can cause increased confusion for people with dementia. So depending on the severity, that may or may not work. And some forms of dementia specifically affect a person's ability to read. So that does not necessarily happen until the later stages of Alzheimer's dementia. But for example, in other forms of dementia, as in frontotemporal dementia, that can happen earlier. And so that's where we think about using these strategies in a flexible way, but you're absolutely right. It is a good option for some people.
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to really thank you from the bottom of my heart for your wonderful presentation today. This was just absolutely outstanding, and so many wonderful strategies and tips that we can use immediately. So thanks everyone for tuning in. This is part of a lecture series we have, so we'll have some information coming up about our next presenter as soon as that date is confirmed. We will send out the slides, so thank you, Dr. Roberts, for sharing, and we'll also include some information about if there's research opportunities or support groups for those of you who might have spouses that are dealing with Alzheimer's, and link you to some of those resources. So we'll include that with the slides. So again, thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you very much, Dr. Roberts.
Thanks, Margaret. Nice to see everyone. Take care.